At 9:45 in the morning, Tehran time on February 28, 2026, more than 100 Western aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace. Iran operates one of the most heavily layered air defense networks in the Middle East. Radar sites, surface-to-air missile batteries, integrated command and control nodes built specifically to make exactly this kind of incursion impossible. And for a window of roughly 30 minutes, by the Pentagon's own account, none of it saw a thing. Not a warning, not a lock, not a single missile fired at aircraft that were, for all practical purposes, invisible. This did not happen because Iran's systems failed on their own. It happened because before a single fighter jet crossed the border, the digital battlefield had already been cleared. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how an entire national air defense network got blinded without a single bomb being dropped on it first, what the Pentagon has actually confirmed about how they did it, and why this specific tactic should worry every country running the kind of hardware Iran was running. Quick word before we get into it. I focus specifically on the cyber and electronic warfare layer of modern conflicts. The part that happens before the missiles and the headlines, the part that rarely gets a press conference of its own. Everything in this video is sourced to on-the-record statements from military leadership, confirmed reporting, and named cybersecurity trackers. I will tell you clearly what has been confirmed and what remains classified or speculative. Let's get into it. To understand how something this large goes dark, you first need to understand what it takes to keep it lit up in the first place. An integrated air defense system, or IADS, is not one device. It is a network. Radar stations spread across the country feeding data upward, command and control nodes fusing that data into a single picture of the sky, and surface-to-air missile batteries waiting on instructions from that fused picture to know what to shoot and when. The entire system only works if every layer can talk to every other layer in real time. A radar site that detects an aircraft is useless unless that detection reaches a command center. A missile battery is useless unless it receives a targeting order from that command center. The network is the weapon, not any single radar dish or launcher sitting in the desert. That interdependency is exactly what makes an IADS a target in its own right, separate from anything it is meant to protect. You do not need to destroy every radar site or every missile battery to defeat the system. You only need to break the connections between them, or feed the network false or delayed information, and the individual pieces become useless, even while they remain physically intact. This is the foundational idea behind what the military calls non-kinetic effects, disabling a system without ever firing a weapon at it directly. This is also why air defense networks are traditionally judged less by the raw specifications of their individual components and more by the redundancy and integrity of their communication layer. A country can field the newest surface-to-air missile system in the world, with impressive published range and altitude figures, and still have that system rendered functionally useless if the data feeding it arrives late, arrives wrong, or does not arrive at all. Military planners have understood this weak point for decades, which is precisely why so much modern investment in electronic warfare and cyber capability is focused not on outshooting an adversary's missiles, but on quietly severing the connections those missiles depend on before they are ever given a reason to fire. This is precisely what U.S. Cyber Command and U.S. Space Command executed on the morning of February 28th, ahead of the opening strikes of what became a much larger conflict. According to General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Cyber Command and Space Command were, in his own words, the first movers of the operation. Before the first fighter aircraft launched from the carrier deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the digital groundwork for the strike had already been laid. The Pentagon has remained deliberately tight-lipped about the specific technical methods used, which is standard practice for operations that rely on vulnerabilities the military does not want adversaries to know have been discovered and closed. But intelligence sources cited in reporting on the operation describe the target set clearly enough. Core routers and command and control nodes inside Iran's air defense network, the exact junction points where radar detections are supposed to become missile launch orders. Here's the part that should genuinely alarm anyone who understands how these systems are built. Reporting indicates the operation exploited a previously unknown vulnerability in regional networking hardware, the kind of infrastructure equipment that does not just sit inside Iran's own systems, but is used more broadly across networks throughout the region. A flaw like that is not a one-time trick against a single country's setup. It is a structural weakness sitting inside hardware that other nations, potentially including U.S. allies, may be running as well, discovered and used once in a live operation before the vendor even knew it existed. The effect of exploiting that vulnerability was, by multiple accounts, close to total. Iranian radar operators were effectively ghosted. Their systems continued running, continued displaying what looked like normal operational status, while the actual detection and reporting pathway that should have flagged incoming aircraft simply did not function. For roughly 30 critical minutes, more than 100 Western aircraft moved through Iranian airspace as though the airspace belonged to no one. not because Iran's radar operators were asleep at their posts, because the network telling them what their own radar was seeing had already been quietly taken apart before the aircraft ever arrived. If this sounds almost too clean to be real, it is worth knowing that this is not the first time exactly this kind of operation has worked, and worked decisively, against a heavily defended target. In September 2007, Israeli aircraft flew into Syrian airspace to strike a suspected nuclear reactor site near Deir ez-Zor, in an operation widely referred to afterward as Operation Orchard. Syria, at the time, operated a Russian-supplied air defense network considered one of the most sophisticated in the region. According to widely reported accounts that emerged over the following years, Israeli electronic warfare aircraft effectively blinded that network during the strike window, reportedly through a combination of electronic jamming and, according to some later reporting, a network intrusion that fed the Syrian system a false, quiet picture of the sky, while the actual strike aircraft flew through completely undetected. Syrian air defense crews reportedly never engaged a single target during the raid, despite operating equipment theoretically capable of doing exactly that. The parallel to Operation Epic Fury is not subtle. Both operations targeted the connective tissue of the air defense network rather than its individual components. Both relied on the defending country's confidence in Russian-derived or Russian-adjacent networking and radar architecture, hardware that, in both cases, turned out to have exploitable weaknesses the operators themselves had no way of detecting in real time. And in both cases, the defending nation's own equipment worked exactly as designed right up until the moment it mattered most, at which point it simply reported nothing at all, which from a radar operator's chair looks identical to a genuinely quiet sky. That is the pattern worth sitting with. This is not a freak, one-off technical fluke that happened to work against Iran specifically in February 2026. It is the second major documented instance, nearly 2 decades apart, of an air defense network built around similar architecture getting cleanly defeated through non-kinetic means before a strike package ever crossed the border. If you're a defense planner anywhere in the world running comparable networking infrastructure, that is not a historical curiosity. That is a pattern with your name potentially on the next entry. Before I get into what happened inside Iran in the hours immediately after this operation, and why the country's own response to the strikes made the situation even harder to track from the outside, I want to ask one thing. If this is giving you the layered, technical breakdown of modern cyber-enabled warfare that a 30-second news clip never actually gets into, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. This is exactly the kind of operation that gets one sentence in mainstream coverage and then disappears from the conversation, even though it fundamentally reshapes how future conflicts will open. I track this layer of every major operation in depth. Stay subscribed so you don't miss the next one. What happened next compounds the story in a way that makes the full picture even harder to piece together, and genuinely strange to watch unfold in real time. According to NetBlocks, the Internet Monitoring Organization that tracks connectivity disruptions worldwide, nationwide internet traffic inside Iran collapsed to roughly 4% of normal levels within hours of the strike's beginning. Government websites went offline. The state news outlet IRNA stopped functioning. The IRGC linked outlet Tasnim was reportedly hacked and displayed messages critical of Iran's supreme leader before it too went dark. Whether this collapse was purely the result of continued outside cyber operations, a deliberate blackout ordered by Iran's own government, or some combination of both, remains genuinely unclear and is described differently across different sources. NetBlocks' own CEO offered a read that leans toward deliberate, self-imposed blackout, suggesting the Iranian government would have deployed exactly this kind of shutdown to counter further outside cyber attacks during its own military response, and separately to prevent metadata and user-generated content, photos, location tags, ordinary social media activity, from inadvertently exposing the locations of senior regime figures during a period of active airstrikes. That is a genuinely rational, if grim, piece of wartime logic. If your command and control network has already been shown to be penetrable once, in the exact window that mattered most, cutting off nearly all outside connectivity is one of the few remaining tools left to limit what an adversary can still see or exploit. The blackout that followed the strikes did not last 30 minutes. Separate tracking documented an internet blackout inside Iran, stretching across more than 4 months in total, tied to a mix of the ongoing military conflict and the government's response to a wave of domestic protests running in parallel. Iran's own communications minister acknowledged the shutdown was costing the country's economy an estimated $35 million a day. That is the scale of disruption a 30-minute blind spot in an air defense network can ultimately cascade into. A national economy bleeding tens of millions of dollars daily, months after the specific operation that started the chain of events had already concluded. Zoom out, because the significance of this operation extends well past what happened to Iran specifically on one morning in February. Modern warfare increasingly opens in the cyber and electronic domain before it opens in the kinetic one, and Operation Epic Fury is one of the clearest, most publicly confirmed examples of that shift actually working as intended at real scale. The strategic logic is straightforward once you see it laid out. Physically destroying an adversary's air defense network requires flying strike aircraft directly into contested airspace, while that network is still fully operational and actively trying to shoot those aircraft down. Blinding that same network first, through non-kinetic means, before a single strike aircraft crosses the border, turns what would otherwise be one of the most dangerous phases of any air campaign into something closer to a routine transit. 100-plus aircraft moving through what should have been among the most heavily defended airspace in the region without a single missile fired in response is not a minor tactical footnote. It is close to the ideal outcome any air campaign planner could hope for. The uncomfortable follow-up question is who else is running the kind of networking architecture that made this possible, and whether they know it. Iran's air defense infrastructure, like Syria's in 2007, leans heavily on Russian-supplied and Russian-derived systems, widely used not just by Iran, but across a range of countries that either purchased Russian equipment directly or built their own networks around similar underlying architecture. A previously unknown vulnerability exploited once in a live operation against one specific deployment of that architecture does not necessarily stay unique to that one country's setup. It raises a real question about how many other national air defense networks are currently running comparable underlying hardware, unaware that a similar blind spot may exist inside their own systems, waiting for the specific set of conditions that would expose it. There's also a harder lesson here about the limits of hardware-based deterrence generally. Iran invested heavily, over decades, in building a physically dense, technically layered air defense network specifically to deter exactly this kind of incursion. On paper, that investment should have made the country's airspace genuinely difficult to violate. In practice, the entire physical investment was rendered irrelevant for the 30 minutes that mattered most, not because any individual radar or missile battery failed, but because the network connecting them was compromised before it ever had the chance to do its job. That is the core lesson every country investing in traditional air defense hardware now has to sit with. The strength of your radars and missiles matters far less than the security of the network stitching them together, and that network layer is precisely where a well-resourced adversary is now most likely to strike first. It is worth adding one more layer of nuance here, because it is easy for a story like this to slide into overstatement. 30 minutes of blindness is not the same thing as a permanently defeated air defense system, and Iran's network did not stay dark for the remainder of the conflict that followed. Reporting on the broader campaign describes a war that continued for weeks after this opening operation, with strikes and counterstrikes on both sides, meaning Iran's forces did regain functional use of at least portions of their air defense capability once the initial blind window closed. What Operation Epic Fury demonstrates is not that Iran's entire military was rendered permanently helpless. It demonstrates something narrower and, in some ways, more unsettling. That the single most dangerous 30 minutes of any air campaign, the opening window when an adversary's defenses are theoretically at their most alert and most lethal, can be reduced to close to zero risk if the network layer is compromised first. That is not total victory. It is something more specific and more replicable. A proof of concept that the opening minutes of a war can now be effectively pre-scripted by whichever side wins the cyber fight that happens before anyone sees a single missile in the sky. Two things before you go. First, if this gave you a clearer, more technical picture of how modern air campaigns actually open than the headline coverage did, share it with someone who follows military or cybersecurity news. This specific tactic is going to keep showing up in future conflicts, and most coverage treats each instance as an isolated surprise, rather than part of an established pattern. Second, I want your take in the comments. Do you think other countries running similar air defense architecture are aware of this specific vulnerability class? Or is this exactly the kind of blind spot that stays hidden until it gets exploited again somewhere else? And should more governments be disclosing operational details like this publicly? Or does the secrecy itself serve a legitimate purpose? Drop your take below. I read every comment, and if this was worth your time, hit like before you go. Here's where this stands. On the morning of February 28, 2026, before the first strike aircraft launched from the USS Abraham Lincoln, U.S. Cyber Command and U.S. Space Command moved first, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff himself, layering non-kinetic effects against Iran's integrated air defense network. By exploiting a previously unknown vulnerability in regional networking hardware, the operation effectively ghosted Iranian radar operators, severing the link between what their systems detected and what their command structure actually saw for a window reported at roughly 30 critical minutes. During that window, more than 100 Western aircraft moved through Iranian airspace without a single missile fired in response. This was not unprecedented. It closely mirrors what happened to Syria's air defense network during Israel's 2007 Operation Orchard Strike, suggesting a repeatable, proven tactic against similarly architected systems rather than a one-time fluke. In the hours and days that followed, Iran's internet connectivity collapsed to roughly 4% of normal levels. Government and state media sites went dark, and the country entered a blackout that would eventually stretch across months, reportedly costing its economy tens of millions of dollars a day. The core lesson sitting underneath all of it is this: Iran's physical air defense investment, the radars, the missile batteries, the command centers, remained fully intact throughout, and none of it mattered, because the network connecting those pieces together was compromised before the fight ever really began. Any country running comparable underlying architecture now has a very specific, very real question to answer about its own vulnerability, and right now, nobody outside a classified briefing room actually knows the answer. Stay locked in, because this is exactly the kind of story that resurfaces the next time a similar operation runs somewhere else in the world.